The Reluctant Time Traveler. By Sabreman Carter. It was about 8:15 p.m. when he arrived home from work that evening. To everyone who knew him, George was a quiet, well-spoken man with grey hair and glasses. He worked for a local railway company as a materials handler. George's bright red car pulled into the driveway of his three-bed semi-detached home, a couple of miles east of the town center. He was feeling a little weary towards the end of the day, and he had a hectic day. All he really wanted to do now was to get into the house and rest. It was Friday evening and it was still quite warm and sunny outside, as he stepped onto the driveway. He had just finished the last shift of the week. He wanted a cup of tea, and perhaps a couple of biscuits. As he entered the house, George looked down at his phone. There had been a couple of missed calls, whilst he had been out at work. George pressed the button on the top of his phone twice, to see who had been calling him. He could see straight away that the person who had called twice that day was his father. Without having to look up the number, George dialed 14713 on his phone. At the other end of the phone was an elderly gentleman in his late 60s to early 70s. A familiar voice called out from the other end of the line. It was his father. "Hello, George," answered the voice from the other end. "Hello, Dad," was George's reply. "How are you keeping, Dad?" said George. "Not too bad under the circumstances," came the reply from the old man, who had not long since had a quadruple heart bypass done. "How's work going, George?" replied his dad. "Dad, you know we are always busy, serving the world's railways," replied George. Later that same evening, George sat down in his favorite armchair. George was drifting in and out of sleep. In front of him was a gas fire. He was very weary. He had a cup of tea, and the tireder he got, his cup began dropping down in front of him, and as his grip was loosening on the handle of the cup so that he spilled tea onto his legs, which woke him up with a start. He was dozing off in the living room, whilst being sat in front of a large TV set. The TV was on, and George had just had his evening meal, which meant that he was now feeling very sleepy. He fell asleep again in front of the TV set and the fire. George was awoken some time later by the fact that he felt cold. "I must turn the gas up," George said out loud to himself, but as he opened his eyes, George could see none of the familiar things that were in his living room. Where was the settee? Where had the TV gone? He looked straight in front of him to the mantelpiece. Where was the mantelpiece? When he looked around again, George began to realize he was no longer in his own home. In fact, George quickly realized that he was not in a building at all, but outside, in the middle of a large muddy field. He thought out loud, "Where the bloody hell am I, and how did I get here? There must be someone around I can ask," he said to himself. The only sounds he heard were those of birds singing in the trees nearby. Apart from the sound of birds singing, there were no other sounds to be heard anywhere about him. By this time George was feeling both cold and hungry. All he was wearing was a pair of blue jeans, and a black short-sleeved t-shirt. He was also wearing a pair of short red socks, and his house slippers. He was shivering due to the cold. He shouted at the top of his voice, "Hello, is there anyone there?" But there was no reply. He looked down the field towards a small wooded area and began to walk towards it. He did not have a clue as to where he was going, or how long it would take him to get there. Once George had reached the trees, he thought that he'd be able to rest up for a while, and take some shelter from the wind that was biting into his unprotected body. But while he was out in the open, he was vulnerable to attack. Although he thought that he was still in the 20th century, he would somehow feel safer knowing he was hidden from view by the trees in the wood. Little did George know what dangers were in the wood with him, and what would soon be facing him. He was unaware of eyes that were watching him from behind the trees as he walked by them. Suddenly George felt a sharp pain in his left leg as he looked down at the wound. He was hit on the head by a heavy object from behind. When George came to, he found himself in a round wooden hut, with a thatched roof, but the hut was filled with smoke. George was finding it hard to breathe in there. He tried to move, but found that he was tied and tethered by a large rope. One half of the rope was attached to George, the other half was attached and wrapped around the center beam inside the wooden hut. By now George could hear voices, he couldn't make out what they were saying. But he could hear people talking. He spoke out loud, "Hello, my name is George," but there was still no reply. By now the voices were getting louder, but George still could not understand them. A large man entered the hut, he was looking at George. He waved his spear at him. Not wanting to offend the man, George stood up to his feet, the best he could, only to fall back down again in pain. George looked at his leg, the leg which was giving him such pain. It was his left leg, there he saw, a gaping open wound. George blacked out again. When he came to, he saw a young woman leaning over him, she was cleaning his wound up. George did not know what she was saying, because she spoke in a strange language, that he had not heard before. She brought him an earthenware bowl with something that both looked and tasted foul. Although he did not like the taste, George still managed to eat it all. He had not eaten for some time, so this meal, although foul, was welcome to him. The next day when George awoke, it was early. He soon realized that the big man was the head man of the village. He found himself being herded out into a large field. Another man with a sharp spear was prodding George with it, much to George's annoyance. George said to himself under his own breath, "If he does that once more, I'll take that bloody spear off him, and prod him with the damn thing." George was waiting his time. By now the bloke with the spear was trying to make George work harder, but George was biding his time. 1, 2, 3, now. George yanked the spear out of his guard's hand. Now the guard found himself laid on his back, with the spear at his own throat. George was about to thrust the spear into his guard's neck, when he saw flames out of the corner of his eye coming from the village. George began shouting, "Fire! Fire!" as loud as he could. George dropped the spear, and caught hold of the man's hand, pulling him up to his feet. George pointed to the village, trying to make the man understand that the village was on fire. He pointed to the guard, then back to the village again. The guard looked at George, and then to the village. The guard shouted something to the others, who were there with them, and they all ran towards the village. George raced with them the best he could. The flames were too fierce to enter the first hut. George entered the second hut and brought out a young child. He lay her on the floor and began to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. The chief of the village thought that George was a hero. When the young child came to, coughing and spluttering, color was coming back into her face. This was the chief's youngest daughter, a girl of about 6. She was roughly the same age as George's own daughter. George re-entered the hut again, this time pulling out the chief's only son, but he was dead. Then George re-entered the hut a third time, pulling out what looked like another body. This was the chief's oldest daughter. She was unconscious. George began to give her mouth-to-mouth. She was in her early 20s. Her body was unarmed, other than a bump on her head, which she got when a large piece of roof fell in on her. It was not long after that the chief ordered that George's ropes be taken off. He began to learn the language of the people that he found himself living with. George was by now classed as part of the chief's own family. He was no longer treated as a slave, and was free to come and go as he saw fit. The chief's eldest daughter fell in love with George, although he had told her about his own family, and his desire to get back home again. She went with him to the edge of the wood, where George had been captured by her tribe. They both walked up to the top of the hill. As George turned to say goodbye, he looked at his companion's face. By now tears were streaming down it. She knew that she would never see him again. He held her in his arms and spoke softly to her. He wiped the tears away, gently from her face, and returned to the spot where he had first woken up. It was nearly nightfall. George felt tired. Not long after that he was asleep again. When he woke up, George looked around the room, to see where he was. He recognized this place, which was familiar to him but somewhat different. The fireplace was the same, but the wallpaper was different, and some of the furniture was not familiar to him at all. Then suddenly a man entered the room. "Who the bloody hell are you, and what are you doing in my house?" the man demanded to know. "How did you get in?" "I woke up in here," George replied. The man didn't believe George. He checked all the doors and windows in the house, there was no sign of a break-in, all the doors and windows were securely locked. George said, "This is my house." George added, "I have lived here since 1986. The man said, "It's the year 2000, and I have lived here since 1998, now get out before I call the police." George said defiantly, "Well, call the police then, but I'm staying here until I get some answers." Tempers were raised that night, as a couple of policemen tried to sort out the mess. But they were getting nowhere, when George said to the policeman, "Please call Doncaster 995972. The number is for my dad, who will be able to vouch for me." One of the policemen called the number that George had given them, only to find out that the number no longer rang, it had been disconnected. Then they went to the house of George's father, only to find out that the old man, who lived there, had died a couple of years earlier, and that George's relatives had either moved out of the area or disappeared. George asked the police if they could trace his wife and children, but even that drew a blank. He had become a man without a history. Then they checked the missing persons records at the local NIC. Sure enough, there was a picture of George, and a full description of him, and how he had disappeared 3 years earlier. There had been a full search of the house and grounds, in fact they had even dug up both front and rear gardens, in a search for his body. They had however found the body of a young woman in her early 20s who had lain there for about 700 years, when they came back into the room. The police asked George about the house, and did he know about the body that they found under the floorboards, in the living room of George's former home. George replied, "No, I do not know about any body that was buried there." George began to tell them all about his strange adventures that had befallen him. He told them all about the tribe, the fire, and the girl that he had met. The police thought George was making it up, and that he was a bit of a nutcase. One copper said of George, "This bloke's got a few screws loose, he is not a full shilling, he's not firing on all cylinders," meaning that George was a fruitcake. "He's living in Cloud 9 cuckoo land, his story is a fantasy, it's all in his head." George was allowed to go free, because he had done nothing wrong, and they had nothing to hold him on. They did however let him stay the night in one of their cells, because he had nowhere else to go. And he couldn't go back to his former home, as that now had a new owner. For once in his life George was truly alone. Later the next day George visited his old works, to see if he still had a job. One or two of the guys there recognized him, from when he worked there. They even asked him about what he had been doing with his life, since they had last seen him. "We heard that you'd won the lottery, and done a bunk from your lass," came a curt reply from one of George's former workmates, which got a big laugh from all of them. George visited the manager's office, to ask if he could have his old job back. The manager was sympathetic, but told George that there was no chance of him getting his old job back, because it had long since been filled. George thanked him for his time, shook his hand and walked away sadly. Not knowing how he was going to deal with his life, he had to find somewhere else to live. George's first port of call was the job center, quickly followed by the Social Security's office. But everywhere George went, he got the same response: "Sorry, we can't let you have any money, because you have not got a home." George remembered where his wife used to work, and decided to pay her a visit. On reaching his wife's workplace, he said to the clerk behind the desk in reception, "Please, can I speak to Mrs. Carol Smith?" "Sorry, love, but no one with that name works here," replied the clerk. George told her she works in the wages department. "Please, can you check it out for me?" The woman at the counter picked up the phone and said, "It's Liz at reception. I've got a bloke here wanting to talk to Mrs. Carol Smith." "Carol Jones she is now, she changed her name by deed poll," said the woman from the wages department. "Is she there?" asked Liz. "No, she only works here part-time now." "Who is it, who wants to see her?" "Liz." "A bloke claiming to be George Smith." "Keep him there, Liz, and I'll come down to you." "I know George," replied the woman from the wages department. George stood in reception with Liz waiting for the woman from the wages department to come down. It seemed to take ages. Finally the lift door opened. And out walked a familiar face. "Hello, George," said the attractive woman who was now stood in front of him. George smiled back and said, "Hello, Barbara, where is Carol?" Barbara said, "She doesn't want to see you again, George." "But why?" replied George. "You deserted her," came back Barbara's reply. "At least tell me where she is, Barbara," George asked. "So I can talk to her and tell her my story, if you won't tell me where she is. Then at least phone her up, and ask her to meet me somewhere," said George. "Okay," Barbara replied. A few days later George received a knock on the door. He had found a friend willing to put him up for a few days. To his surprise there stood Carol, his wife. "Hello, George," she said. "What the hell are you doing here and where have you been, George?" she asked. He began to tell her the story as Carol listened. She then told him that she thought the story was a little feeble, and that even his 14-year-old son could come up with a better story than that himself. "To be frank, George, I don't love you anymore, and I want you out of my life forever," she said. George was somewhat stunned by this news, and he felt completely gutted by it. Here was the woman he loved telling him that she no longer cared for him. For several days after that George was walking around in a daze. He did not know what to do next. He had been interested in computers, prior to his disappearance, and was wondering what had happened to his old machine. He had been given Carol's number. So he phoned up on the off chance that she might be able to tell him where it was. She told him that she had sold it to a woman from the village of Armthorpe. She even told him that the woman had bought it for her son. George thanked her and replaced the receiver again. George went back to the village of Armthorpe the next day, where he had lived before he and Carol had got married. He called on the woman, who had bought the computer for her son, only to find a lonely woman, who was about the same age as him. George knocked on the door, and a lady stood there. George spoke. "Sorry to bother you, Mrs. Shipton. I understand from my wife that you bought my old computer for your son." "Yes," she replied. George asked her if she still had it and could he see it. He then told her all about his adventures, and Mrs. Shipton told George all about her son's own disappearance, which had happened not long after they had bought George's old computer from George's wife. George asked Mrs. Shipton if he could use the computer again. She replied yes, he could. George turned it on and ran the program that he had been running before he vanished the first time. Mrs. Shipton still wanted to find out what had happened to her son. So George looked at the last log entry on the computer program, and found out that Mrs. Shipton's son had been looking at Mother Shipton's cave, in the 1500s, and he had been transported back in time to the 16th century, and to the town of Knaresborough. George went back in time 700 years, and was able to meet his lady friend again. There he became chief of the village, husband and father of his own tribe. Mrs. Shipton went in search of her long-lost son, and became known as Mother Shipton, witch, seer, and mystic. In the ancient town of Knaresborough in North Yorkshire, her cave is still there to this day. George did not need a complicated time machine to make his final journey. In the end, it was the power of his own dreams that proved that he could travel through both time and space, and the most important power in the universe, the power of love, the love for someone who wanted to be with him. I hope you have enjoyed my little story and that it makes sense to you. The end.